Hello, my name is Rohan Thompson. I'm the Workplace Equity Manager at Peel District School Board, and I'm honored to be part of this amazing conversation to talk about anti-Black racism, systemic racism, and such. But to sort of open us up, you know, it's a very unique and important moment in time that we're in the world and also here at Peel District School Board. COVID-19 has disrupted the world and society in ways that we never could have imagined. And we also see that COVID-19 is not an equal opportunity disease. We see that Black, racialized, and the intersection of poverty of those communities, that they are disproportionately being infected by COVID. And it's not only that, we see that those folks are also working in professions that put them most at risk. We also see, we've also seen worldwide the murders of Black and racialized people at the hands of police services globally. Some of the names that come to mind are DeAndre Campbell, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Ijaz Chowdhury, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, just to name a few. While we also see police able to successfully detain and arrest violent white criminals and bring them in safely. We see Black youth, along with allies from across the spectrum, mobilizing across the world, and also right here in Peel to amplify the Black Lives Matter movement and make demands for change. PDSB also was subject to a ministry review that ultimately led to binding directives and several strong messages from the minister's office that racism and anti-Black racism in the board will not be tolerated. The ministry has also appointed a supervisor, and all of this is due to the fact of the intense anti-Black racism that exists within Peel District School Board. And that is just some of the reasons why we're having this very important conversation right now. Delighted to be here, star-studded panel, Black woman magic, Black woman excellence. In some way I managed to be part of this, so I just want to thank you guys for letting me be part of the discussion. And also grateful and honored that you're willing to share your brilliance, your expertise, and your wisdom for all of the folks across the system. I also think it's really important to honor the courage that you're displaying and the fortitude, because we also understand that speaking truth to power, speaking about anti-Black racism does come at a cost. In particular, we see that Black women are doing the majority of the heavy lifting in relation to this movement, and you guys are also the target and bear the brunt of much of the violence. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that and say that, and also thank you for putting yourself out there to lead this conversation and be leaders in the community around disrupting and dismantling anti-Black racism, so thank you. So before we get into the conversation, I think it's really important if you guys take an opportunity to introduce yourselves, your role, your various roles with the board, and sort of how, from your perspective, how we got here today.
Thank you, Rohan, for your words and for your introduction. So good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Wilson. I am a vice principal at Mayfield Secondary School. Prior to being at Mayfield, I was the coordinator of Indigenous education, the coordinator of anti-Black racism education, and also an equity resource teacher. In addition to my professional work, I do identify as a Black woman, and also I identify as an academic. I am finishing my PhD. I hope to graduate in the spring, and it is in social justice education, focusing specifically on what equity leadership looks like in Ontario school boards. And so a lot of my professional and academic practice is informed by critical race theory, anti-colonial education, and Black feminist methodologies. So I'm happy to be here today, elated to sit here on this panel with Natasha and Fiona and Rohan, so thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Rohan. I'm glad to be here with Melissa, Fiona, and Rohan to engage in a meaningful and much needed conversation. My name is Natasha Henry. I am a curriculum consultant to the Peel District School Board. For 20 years, I've been an activist educator, and I'm a historian specializing in Black Canadian history.
Hello, thank you, Rohan, for that lovely introduction and for setting the context for our morning's discussion. I'm happy to be here with Melissa and with Natasha, both of whom I've worked with closely in the equity department. My name is Fiona Lloyd Henry, I'm a vice principal at Rickhanson Secondary School. Before I was a vice principal, I served as the coordinator for equity and inclusive education, primarily responsible for We Rise Together, the board's action plan to support Black students. I have also been a resource teacher, a department head, and I'm happy to be engaging in this conversation at this time.
So the conversation today, I think it's really going to be premised around some overarching questions, right? And the overarching questions that we have to sort of inform the conversation and what you're going to lead us through is around who does public education serve? Whose stories are told and whose stories are missing? And so as you each sort of take the opportunity to provide some definitions and concepts and relate them to those overarching questions, just really want to just share with you a little bit how it's going to go. So each of you will have the opportunity to speak first around your particular definitions, and then that'll go on for a number of minutes, up to 4 minutes. And then we'll get into a bit of a discussion after each person has had the opportunity for their definition. Make sense?
Thank you, Rohan. So there are certain things that we know from scholars who study race and racism about the concept race. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that race is not just about biology. In fact, most scholars are in agreement that there is no such thing as race as clear biological categories. So we know, for example, throughout history that there have been many theories and experiments trying to clearly delineate between the different racial categories, but we know that modern science has disproved and debunked these again and again. And so what race is a social construct. What that means is that we as a society, we define and we continue to redefine what the racial categories are and who belongs in these racial categories. So even though race is not a biological concept, we continue to use this concept for many reasons. So to begin with, we were all born into a racist society that already had these categories defined for us. And although they're evolving, we did not have an option of whether we wanted to opt in or out of that. But in addition, people's lived experiences are very different depending on which racial category people think, people think that others are in. So for example, if you identify as white or people identify you as white in our society, then you are more likely to be seen as normal, pleasant, acceptable, and really non-contentious at all. As opposed to, as we know from the review, Black people are often seen as not belonging, as suspicious, as more criminal, and needing to be controlled more. So in addition to that, people also draw a lot of their identity from these racial categories. So myself, as a critical race theorist, even though I know there's not biological substance to this identity as Black, I do identify as a Black female. And then we also know that many of our communities build solidarity based off of these concepts as well. And so that's why we still use this concept as race. When it comes to Peel District School Board, there are certain things that we know for sure from our workforce census and our student census. So for example, we know that more than 80% of our students do not identify as white. And yet almost the exact opposite is true when it comes to our staff. So if we account for all of our staff in Peel, about 70% of our staff identify as white. If we only consider the teaching population, that number increases to about 80%. And so while we are getting increasingly comfortable talking about this data, what we have yet to talk about are the consequences of this data, which leads me to my second concept, which is whiteness. So when 70 or 80% of your staff identify as white, there are going to be consequences to this. What we see in Peel District School Board is that there is a culture of whiteness. And so what do I mean by that? This is when our norms, our institutional beliefs, values, and I'm not talking about our mission, vision, and values, I'm talking about our day-to-day practices, the expected behavior for us as professionals, is all really based on the perspectives and expectations of white people, who are the overwhelming majority. There are also many characteristics of whiteness because there actually are whole fields called whiteness studies. So this isn't something I'm making up, I'm drawing from scholars who study whiteness as an actual concept. So there are many different parameters of whiteness, but I think what's important for us to focus on as we continue to talk about the review is certain characteristics around denial and the ways that white people generally do not want to speak about race and racism. And of course, I'm not accounting for every white person out there, so people don't need to get defensive about that. I'm talking about the culture of whiteness in general. So there's a fine reluctance and often a refusal to discuss race and racism, and often even deny its existence. And in this denial, there's also this expectation that other people don't speak about race and racism. So often what we see is that white people, they make it clear that no one in this space shall talk about race and racism, and often then become very irrationally emotional, defensive, and argumentative when the topics of race and racism are brought up. And as Superintendent McCutcheon was recalling earlier, this is white fragility. So if we are overall talking about things, if we are avoiding talking about things such as racism, because we're not talking about race, and if we're not talking about race, then we can't talk about racism. And if we are also not talking about other structures of power, such as colonialism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and so forth, then what we're left with in whiteness is this idea of individualism. All that matters is the individual, or objectivity, or meritocracy. Meaning that when we look at meritocracy, this idea that those who are successful via capitalism's definitions of successful have somehow earned that, and those who have not attained that level of success, and again, success, need to just simply work harder because there's no such thing as these structures of power that are shaping their lives. And so in conclusion, just to wrap it up here, is that the problem in education, I would say, is that there has never been an expectation that our vast majority of educators who are white, that they speak, know, or understand race and racism. And so this is a problem when the vast majority of your students are racialized and experiencing racism. So for the few teachers that do speak about race and racism, because I know they're out there because I've worked with many of them, is that when they do speak about race and racism, it always focuses on the disempowered minority. So what I mean by that is that in Peel, we often hear educators talking about indigeneity. They're increasingly talking about blackness, but yet we cannot talk about whiteness. And actually, some people will go as far as to say that you cannot even say that word. I have heard people say that when you say whiteness or white supremacy, you are being racist. That is absurd. I'm just going to put that on the table for the panel. If you cannot say whiteness, or if we cannot deconstruct concepts such as white supremacy, that is a problem. That denial and refusal to talk about systems of power is exactly what allows this to fester. So last two things that I will say here is that one, if you are a white educator, you need to be talking about race. All right, so it's not left for Black people just to talk about race and racism. You as well need to talk about race. Well, I would challenge white educators that are listening to really understand not just Blackness and indigeneity and anti-racism and larger concepts like anti-oppression, but I would encourage you to also study your own whiteness and also understand how you have been socialized into whiteness, probably unwillingly as well. And then ask yourself, what does your whiteness mean for your professional practice? Thank you.
A number of things sort of jumped out for me, but one of the pieces sort of just want to throw out to folks, and hopefully you guys can show up and discuss a little bit, is this piece around anti-Blackness and sort of how it gets framed around those who are most marginalized are the victims of anti-Black racism. And so I just want to bring a couple of examples. Most recently we've seen in the news the experience of Masai Ujiri and what happened to him at the hands of the police when the Raptors won the World Championship, the NBA Championship last year. And we also saw what happened to Jagmeet Singh in Parliament when he was attempting to bring forward a motion to address some of the systemic racism. And there was a member from the bloc who performed their anti-Blackness and their systemic racism, and then Jagmeet was punished for calling that out. And so what I mean is we have two very powerful men, right? But yet they were still subject to it. So can we just sort of talk a little bit around how it doesn't matter whether or not marginalized or not, it still comes for you?
Thanks for sharing that Rohan. It makes me think of a conversation I was having just this morning with Natasha as I was driving here about how we frame things. So folks, particularly people of color, Black people especially, when we talk about the violence of anti-Blackness, we are framed as a problem, as if the problem is not the problem you're pointing out, but the problem is pointing out what is wrong.
There's a couple of observations that I'd like to make as well in terms of how we see this, the silencing and how we see the culture of whiteness playing out as it relates to interacting with the community. And so in the review, it says, that people hold the view, non-Black staff have held the view that because the community has been so persistent and so vocal around raising the realities of anti-Black racism in the system, that has led us to be where we are today, and not the fact that the system, or the board, a microcosm of the broader public education system, is the problem. And so we see, I've observed how that silencing, that you talked about with Jagmeet and with Messiah Jerry, how that has come into play. We've seen that in the dynamics at the board meetings, and the idea that or say we're welcoming community, that community is welcome, but community is welcome contingent upon their assimilation and their conforming to this culture of whiteness that plays out in the board meetings. And failure to do so then creates these tense situations, and we've seen that go on for quite some time. And then even the rules and the regulations. And so if we're really open to community, how can we understand how communities engage differently? So Melissa, you talked about the ways, for example, that a lot of Black and African communities engage in conversations and debate. And how much does the board and the board staff see that and understand that and welcome that? If we really want to affect change and we really want to embrace partnerships with community, with parents, with teaching staff and other staff, then what does the board have to do in order to reflect on the culture of whiteness that has been impeding that kind of flattened engagement with the community?
It's funny, Natasha, that you bring up, for example, the board meetings, which have been, for Black folks, traumatizing. It really is. It's the Roberts rules that we have to abide by. It's this trained looks and the defensiveness. You talk about whiteness and you talk about the ways in which the board seemingly rejects all aspects of Blackness, of Black identity. We walk into the boardroom, we're there to say, or children do not feel welcome in schools, or children don't feel a sense of belonging, or children don't see themselves reflected in your classrooms. Education is a right, right? It's a social service guaranteed to all Canadians. And in spite of all of the advocacy, years, decades of advocacy, there's still a view that Black parents neglect their children, Black parents don't love their children, Black parents don't want an education for their children. These are all dominant discourses. And then you look in the boardroom, and there's this notion of silencing of the voices of the people who are concerned. And you could see why that could cause a little bit of a dissonance, because you can't, on the one hand, say that we don't care, and then when we show up to show our care, then you say, you're just noisy and you just can't follow the routine and you can't just follow the pace of how we're supposed to go and you can't engage how you're supposed to go, as if any sort of engagement has to be dictated to by whiteness, by white supremacy, by this notion that you can talk about your oppression, but only in ways that are sanctioned by us.
So when I talk about the culture of whiteness, and I gave that definition earlier about it, the practices and expected behaviors based off of the white norms, based off the white majority, the board meetings is literally a perfect example for us to focus on, right? So I'll start with the Black community. When we show up as a Black community, we are loving towards each other, kind towards each other. We will sit in emotion with each other. So whether it's sadness and we stay together, or whether we express anger together, expressing emotion in the Black community is not seen as a bad thing. In fact, if you sit there as an emotionless robot and someone is pouring out their tears to you, or bringing their children into the space, bringing their most valuable, precious thing in their life into the space, talking about how they're harmed, and you're just, yeah, I mean, that is actually seen as aggressive, right? As opposed to the white norms of an institution is that you can come to this microphone and you can say everything you want, but we're just going to sit there and could absolutely control our body in every way. No facial expression, no body movement, no tears, no reaction whatsoever. And so in that way, we can almost draw a line in the sand between cultural norms of Blackness and being together and, expressing our true selves and showing up and being together versus this culture of institutional whiteness, which is never show emotion, right? Even when it's called for. I cannot imagine having families come to a microphone telling me about violence that they are experiencing, the children that I'm serving in their community telling me this, and me acting like it's like robotic about it, like, oh, thank you for the story. Can you take notes? Anyone want to take notes? Can you leave your information and move on? That's horrifying to Black people. Like that act right there is an act of violence.
But the passion gets ramped up when there is the suggestion or the pointing out or the naming of the violence in and of itself, right? And then people are aghast. How dare you? Don't you know who, right? And so
Which is hilarious, because if you think, for example, of the Ontario Leadership Framework, if you think about the things that are seen as being positive things to become, for example, promoted, emotional intelligence.
Thank you.
Right? And so you're supposed to have this quality. And I'm sure tons of people who are there sitting stone-faced would recite for you exactly how empathetic they are, exactly how much emotional intelligence they have, right? But at the same time, when it comes on to Black pain, and we're expected to trot it out, by the way, to perform it, because unless you can absolutely demonstrate how violent or how harmful something is, then it really isn't harmful. It really isn't. Like socialized into looking at Black pain and not being moved by that pain. So as a Black person, when I'm seeing, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we continue our conversation, but it's not something that is easy to pass over. Looking at the distress that other people have. Like, we're all educators. We went into this and we said we want to do good by kids, right? But here we are.
And I just wanted to point out one thing, because when we're talking about rage and anger and emotions, we've been talking about negative emotions, but the same is actually true for joy as well. So in school hallways, for example, and I've been in hundreds of schools, when we see white students passing through the hallways, being loud and cheerful and hugging each other and touching each other, before social distancing, of course, and being loud and causing a ruckus, it is seen appropriately as joy and as community and as being together and loving one another. And yet when Black students see it, it provokes surveillance amongst white educators of, why are you being so loud in the hallway? Get to class. What are you doing out here? Why are they so loud all the time? So we can have the exact same behavior out of Black people, same behavior out of white people, and one is deeming to be inappropriate, needing to be controlled, needing more surveillance. Another is seen as kind and loving, and oh, isn't it great that they're so happy to be at school? And so, so it's joy, right? So there is a whole spectrum of this culture of whiteness, and it's not just in the board meetings. That's an example that we've seen and certainly prompted the review, but we can see this culture of whiteness even in the hallways as well.
So, great discussion. But before we pivot, you can't have the conversation about anti-Black racism or racism without talking about whiteness and white supremacy, because one is the byproduct of the other. right? The second point that really came out, especially when we were talking about, what was going on in the trustee board meetings, is that, the premise seems to be as though there needs to be proof of the fact that there was something racist that happened, right? And then we need to investigate to see if it's true. And those who don't have the skill set are the ones who are going to be the investigator and decider of fact. When really the truth is, it's the starting place is that racism is operating. It is our job to find out what it looks like. Right? Fiona, you really did a good job of being able to delineate, this conversation around, passion, right? And being engaged. And depending upon what body it is, it gets interpreted very differently. And so with Black folks, it gets interpreted as problematic. Right? Melissa, you talked about the surveillance, right, of Black bodies in schools and such. One of the pieces you also talked about, Melissa, that I think was really important, and hopefully we get to talk about it a little bit more throughout the course of the conversation, is this notion of consequences, right, in terms of, in our culture of whiteness and talking about anti-Blackness and such. And two of the ways in which it shows up that you discussed was the holding back of rewards, or the threat of holding back rewards, and then punishment. And we sort of glossed over that punishment bit to not really talk about exactly what it looks like, but I think it's important for folks to understand or take that away from what this entire conversation has been so far. And to come back to your one of your points earlier, Fiona, what really sort of resonated with me is this idea of, or this notion that we understand that our board is racist, but there is a price to pay for either naming people who are performing racist acts or actually naming the racist acts in and of itself.
Racism is a system, and it's operationalized through racial hierarchies and supported by institutionalized power. Racism has been and is used to organize Western society and to maintain inequities. It advantages some people and disadvantages others, and it's enacted, this exclusion or marginalization is enacted through laws, policies, and practices. So when Melissa was talking about race and race as a social construct, that's how racism plays out. Racism is fueled through this concept of race and the ways in which particular bodies or groups of people, those racial identities are coded with particular meanings. And we talked about that a little bit in terms of how, and Melissa talked about how Blackness is encoded in often particularly negative ways, and how whiteness is often coded as particularly positive ways and as the dominant norm that structures things. So racism, as I said, is a system, and it is enabled through institutionalized power. And there's a simple math equation that I found and that I like to share in order for people to get a sense of what is meant. And so, when sometimes people will say, oh, well, something is racist, or something is reverse racism, and we really need to push back on these ideas, because if we understand what racism is, then we would understand what it is not. So racism is, we have people hold prejudiced views of particular groups, but that prejudice, when it becomes enabled by power, becomes discrimination. And we see discrimination playing out, that different groups face discrimination based on different parts of their social identities. And here we could talk specifically about racial discrimination. And then when those practices of discrimination are institutionalized and further power is enacted and imposed upon these practices, it becomes institutionalized racism. Professor George Day, he said that racism refers to ideas or practices that establish, maintain, or perpetuate the racial superiority or dominance of one group over another. And for the purpose of this review, and again in better understanding social systems, the racial superiority is in reference to white superiority as a dominant group, and in this particular case, the group who then is disadvantaged are people of African descent. When we understand racism as a system and we understand what has been brought to light through the review, we should be coming to the conclusion, the premise, that the educational system is an inherently racist institution. And we've seen that throughout history. We've seen that in the development and the construction of racially segregated schools right here in Canada. Oftentimes with that example, we may reference the United States, but racially segregated schools were formed as a way to exclude Black children and Black families from a public system that initially began and was open to all people regardless of race, religion, color, or creed, and those were the words. We also see how education plays out as a racist institution through the development of residential schools. And so we see how race is at play, where racially segregated schools were targeting people who were Black, and residential schools were targeting people who were racialized as Indigenous. So this is a historical and a contemporary fact that we must reckon with in order for us to address it and to move forward, really in a future of transformation, if that is what we're seeking. The institution and the individuals who make up the institution have to own up to the institution's racism and and white supremacy, again, as was highlighted throughout the review. Another thing that came out in the review as it relates to racism is that students, young people, talked about teachers' inability or refusal to talk about racism. So teachers must be prepared, they must have the skills and the capacity to facilitate discussions on racism. They need to create spaces for students to talk and engage in critical learning about racism. They've asked for that time and time again. You know, here we are at the end of August, coming off of a summer of an upsurge of political action and activism. A lot of it led by young people of, diverse backgrounds. What are we as educators going to do with, teach them? And how are we going to approach their learning come September? They are very much ready and expecting to engage in some deep conversations. And then racism, as I said, through a construct of race, this social construct, we see how racism is an instrument, it's a mechanism, a part of the broader system of white supremacy. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about white supremacy, what white supremacy is. It's an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. It's a racist ideology that informs the structuring of society and institutions. And again, it's based on ideas of white superiority and the inferiority of other races. It doesn't refer to individual white people per se and their individual and actions. What we want to focus on in understanding white supremacy is how it functions as a system, and is how it's upheld through racism. Superintendent McCutcheon talked earlier about the more comfortable forms of white supremacy that white people can identify, or non-Black people could identify, and can comfortably disassociate themselves from. So for example, whether it's the Ku Klux Klan, or if we're talking about the Pride Boys, people can point out and say those people definitely are white supremacists, and they're very vocal about that, and that is not us. We are not like them. And so the labeling or the identification of white supremacy does not apply to us. However, the system, people need to acknowledge and pay attention to the ways that white supremacy constitutes itself and how it's insidious and part of a larger system, and how that's at play. Because denying that prevents us from addressing the system. And again, when we look at what has come out of the review, it's just more recently that the Peel District School Board has been paid attention to as it relates to anti-Black racism. Years before, there was a lot of work done with Toronto District School Board, but it's important for us again to look at particular school boards as a microcosm, as part of a bigger system at play. We see that in systemic denial, We see that in the ways that there's a move to innocence. It also shows up in ignorance. And so this idea that, people don't know that white supremacy exists and that it's in operation, and this ongoing feigning of ignorance then prevents any way of addressing it. And then it also shows up in the way that counter narratives, the narratives of Black people, Black students, Black families, the Black and African communities, the way that their counter narratives are denied. And so when Fiona talked about how, Black people will say something is racist, and Rohan talked about how, someone will then say, well, how do you know that that's racist? The people who are not well versed in what racism looks like. And so these are some of the ways that we see it play out. We also see it in systemic erasure. The exclusion of some voices and the amplification of others. We see that in the curriculum, which is one of the areas that we will talk more deeply about. We see this through the refusal and the opposition to change and to maintain the status quo. And Melissa had talked about institutional actors and how people are expected to maintain this particular persona and way of functioning within the system. These act upon people to maintain the system of white supremacy. Another way it shows up is through this idea of constantly starting over. And so in starting over and stopping and starting over, the system remains intact. We don't move things. The needle is not moved. And so then things will either be stalled, stopped, or shifted. And things could be shifted either in policies or in practices or in even the physical shifting of people. And that often means the Black people who are refusing to fall in line into these white norms of being within an institution. And then Melissa alluded to another way that it shows out, and it plays out in the broader system as well, is how white logic plays out. And so these sets of ideas that govern the institution and that make the institution run on a daily basis, that explains racism or maintains racism or silences racism, this is another way that it plays out. And so this logic is, several scholars have called it white logic. It's bent in order to maintain the system, again, to explain the way that things should be and have always been, as a way, again, to keep out any challenges to that system. So the way that then equity work as a system is taken up, and how equity work is seen as marginal or outside of challenging the structure, the inherently racist education system, or the equity work perpetuates and maintains the structure that is inflicting that oppression and the inequities that the same equity work is trying to challenge.
So you brought up Dr. George Day definition, or one of his definitions for racism. So he said that ideas or practices that establish or maintain dominance of one group over another. So I'd just like to extrapolate what some of those practices are. There are many. So I think the first practice that I see that is based on whiteness and white supremacy is how people actively, so not just passively, but actively resist doing anti-racism work. So students identified this refusal to talk about racism, but I actually see it's more than that. I constantly hear excuses from educators of why they should not be doing this work. So one common one is, I don't know where to find resources. But then we don't see them try to find resources either. So they just say off the top of my head, I don't know where these resources are. So one is resisting the work. That is a practice that keeps white supremacy intact. But another thing that's similar is denying scholarship on this field. And so when we have medical issues, it is rational that we find medical experts. When we need a building built, it is rational that we would find architects, we would find engineers, and when they come into the spaces, we don't question them, right? We might question them on design and layout and give our opinion, but we don't argue with architects, right? We don't argue with doctors generally. And again, I'm sure there's some people watching like, I argue with my doctor. In general, when someone prescribes something, we listen, right? But when it comes to race and racism, suddenly critical race theory is not seen as a respectable field. Anti-colonial studies is not seen as a respectable field, and this ties to what Fiona will talk about, which is anti-blackness, because the people who are usually the scholars are Black and Indigenous people, and so they are automatically seen as less than. And the last practice that is based in white supremacy, and I hope it comes up in the conversation again, is this feigning ignorance in the terms of explicitly saying, I don't see color. I'm colorblind. I don't see color. Right? And therefore trying to stop the conversation, because if I say I don't see color, then you can no longer speak about it because I don't see color. And so I understand what educators mean when they say this concept. I understand what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is, I'm not racist, so therefore I don't see you as Black, Melissa. Like, I just see you as an administrator. I just see you as Melissa. I just see you as a teacher. I just see you as so forth. So they're trying to remove themselves from this stigma around race and racism. Like, I don't want to be associated with that. But again, this is a practice that keeps white supremacy in place, because if I don't see color, you therefore can't come at me with conversations about race and racism. So I hope those practices, some of those practices, the denying scholarship, the resisting the work, and this move to innocence of colorblindness, I hope that kind of outlines some of these practices that yourself and George Day were talking about.
Our whole system is built on a premise of colorblindness. It is only when white interests converge with Black interests that we will see move. So people can move to innocence. They can say, I don't know, but these are just ways of delaying what they ought to do, what we all know that we should be doing. We know how to educate children. We know what it means to feel like you belong. We know the value of students feeling as if they belong if we expect students to learn. We know that when a child is sitting in a classroom and they're operating from a flight or fight mode, where they're constantly, right? Like, they're constantly thinking about their safety and their security. We know the harm that does to learning. But until we start to see them as human beings, until we start valuing their success, until we start wanting them to thrive, then the vast majority of our teachers, 67% of our staff in Peel, are white. Until that happens, until our interests converge, hopefully that this is what this report will do, because it's, these binding directives speak to the need for Peel to actually adopt anti-racism. The minister has spoken clearly that in the Peel District School Board, there's no place for racism. So hopefully that demonstrates that type of convergence.
And there's a couple of things that came to mind when you're both speaking. And Melissa, when you talked about how as a Black woman, you very much are aware of how white supremacy is at play and how it's enacted upon you. I also want to use that point and expand on that to say that white supremacy is acting on everyone. It's also not acting on white people, but it's acting on the way that it's supposed to be, in the sense that they don't pay attention to it, or they don't see how it's functioning and shaping their lives. And so in as much as white people can say, they don't see race, or it doesn't impact them, or as much as they can say they don't see how this plays out in their lives, that is actually how it's supposed to operate in order to maintain white dominance. And so that is also important. So it's always interrelational. And also when we're talking about the conversation about racism and as a system, and when Fiona will talk about anti-Black racism, how that's enacted on Black people, it's not this abstract idea that is acting on Black people, right? So there are individuals who maintain a system, and then there's this back and forth. So as much as people are disadvantaged, then another set of people are advantaged. And then a second thing that came to mind when we were talking about the ideas or ideologies and scholarship and expertise, we see how that plays out in the educational system. Again, in the curriculum, either through whose stories are actually structure the curriculum. We see that in the intellectual work that our students are exposed to. So whose theories and whose scholarships do our students learn about when they're learning about sociology, when they're learning about anthropology? And again, it's oftentimes white majority intellectual work that they are exposed to, and not to the work and contributions of Black and other racialized people. And so in as much as white supremacy dictates space and practice, it also dictates ideas as well. And so that's something that's very important. And even in terms of how the system operates and the ideas and the thoughts that govern how they do things, those ideas are often majority white scholars, or we see that Black scholarship that is used becomes watered down with whiteness. And so just one quick example is culturally relevant pedagogy, being born out of critical race theory because of the experiences of Black children, right? It's not just this kind of put this diversity sticker or these stories here and these experiences. It really is was a study, a thoughtful study by a Black scholar on how the system was acting upon Black children. And then, but often what I see is that part has been removed from the scholarship and from the understanding and the application of culturally relevant pedagogy. And so I again, expanding how white supremacy works in those very ways around intellectual work and discourse.
Natasha, you did a really great job of talking about racism and what it is, right? In terms of being a system operationalized through institutions, being used as a tool for exclusion, and you see those tools through laws, policies, and such. But you also brought it back to white supremacy, saying that it's rooted in this ideology of white supremacy. And so and I think this is a really important point, so I just want you guys to sort of talk about it just a little bit more. And, and Kika Ojo-Thompson, she talks about this concept of powerful unexamined ideas, right? And so just wondering if you guys can talk about what those powerful unexamined ideas or that particular ideology in terms of characteristics that we describe to Black bodies, and similarly, those ideas or characteristics that we typically ascribe to white bodies, which is ultimately the foundation of which all of this is built on.
I think that beautifully sets us up to talk a little bit about anti-Black racism and what that is. The African Canadian Legal Clinic defines anti-Black racism as a particularly pernicious form of racism that is rooted in our history, Black history of enslavement. And it's directed at Africans and peoples of African descent. It includes everything from the stereotyping, the negative associations and discrimination leveled at Black people. But I want to problematize that a little bit. So we think about these as sort of discriminatory acts and so on, but very often we make it seem like this is very much just an interpersonal thing. And it's not just interpersonal. These are systemic issues that are broader than one-on-one person interaction. Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who speaks a lot about racial capitalism, has a definition that I like, and bear with me because it's a mouthful. She says, racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. I told you it was a lot. So let us take small parts of it. She starts by saying this is state-sanctioned. This is the system. This is the systemic part of racism. So we think about public education. Think about our curriculum. Curriculum is not decided by single teachers. This is something that's written by the state. It's written by the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Education has control over it. We talk about streaming, and we'll go a little bit more about what that means in a second for secondary schools. But academic streaming can happen in particular pathways because we have those pathways in the first place. In Peel, where recently the police has suspended in order to study the school resource officer program. But that I think a recent Carton study showed that it costs something like upwards of $9 million a year to have this. This is not done by individual teachers. And we could talk about not just the police in schools, but policing the habits in schools. We have everything from surveillance cameras all over our schools that staff can monitor. We have duties, for example, that teachers do, where, at this specific time, you're going to walk the hallways. So let us talk about how policing happens, how surveillance happens, and how particular forms of surveillance is enacted upon Black students. And you talk about the brilliant Kika Ojo Thompson. Can I add that? And how she, these powerful unexamined ideas. These ideas of Black bodies as being deviant, as being menacing. Research shows that black students are always seen, or Black folks are seen as being bigger than their white counterparts, even when they're the exact same size. So here we are, we're surveilling people, and we have the means to surveil people because we have somebody paying to put cameras into our schools. We have somebody who decides what the curriculum is that pushes students out of classes. And when they're in the hallways, we have a means to watch what it is that they do. And when they don't succeed, or when we consider that they do something that's deviant, we suspend them. Right, and you're further removed from classes, or you're put into a program that's set up just for you. These pull-out programs that are supposed to support students, but that we know remove students from both the intellectual parts of their classes, but also from the social aspects of it, and then we punish them for it. These are things that according to using the frame that Professor Gilmore uses, can be applied for us to see how these are state sanctioned and how they produce different outcomes for different people, and then how we exploit those. We talk about anti-Black racism. I think it's important for us to know that this is not just about disliking some people who have more melanin than others. That there's money to be had, there's power to be had, there's privilege to be had from the exploitation of some people. So when we think about Black students who are not doing well, who are being pushed out of their programs, who are being pushed out of succeeding, it's important to know that there's a whole system, a whole structure of school success and school student success that's built around Black students' failure. Right? When we think about these people walking, police officers having jobs where they could come into schools, show up, and surveil. There are people who are having jobs that's built around Black students not doing well. So I think it's important to note that this is not just a matter of some people are not liked. In creating a particular narrative around Blackness, you can then create the problem, and then create a solution to the problem. A solution, by the way, that ascribes benefit to you. Monetary benefit, capital benefit. And so when we even mention the term school to prison pipeline, there is a certain amount of pushback with that. It's like, what are you really talking about? But we know that this is absolutely true. In simple terms, the school to prison pipeline refers to the codes and the punishments that push students out of school and increase the likelihood of them being involved in the criminal justice system. We know that Black children are removed from classes informally and for informal ways. We know that in Peel, our research shows that Black students are suspended twice as regularly as their non-Black peers. We know as well that Black students are punished more harshly. Black students are punished more harshly for infractions that other students are sometimes not even punished for. Robin Maynard speaks about, this sort of carceral spaces of schools where black students, again, it goes back to how we're seen as deviant, and everything that we're doing is seen as wrong. Some of these suspensions we talk about being punished more harshly included, or a report I think said, that black students were suspended for things like wearing do-rags and wearing hoop earrings. So here we are. They're suspended more regularly and for longer periods of time. And when students are removed from schools, we know that the likelihood of them becoming involved in the youth juvenile criminal system increases. And that for students who are involved in the youth juvenile criminal system are much more likely by the time they get to 25 to be involved in the criminal system. So this removal from classes, very often for spurious reasons, this contributes very often to what we call the school to prison pipeline.
Thank you. I think, so lots to digest there. One of the points the last point that you just made there, I think it really resonates, and I'm not sure if folks always in education really draw the connection. And so if we're pushing folks out of our system, right, where are we pushing them to? Right, because they're going to show up someplace, right? And the research, shows something to the tune of 64%, something to that effect, of those in our federal criminal justice system do not have a high school diploma, right? And then it's easy to connect the dots to be like, so who is disproportionately overrepresented in the criminal justice system at the federal level, right? We have indigenous and black folks, right? So I think that's a really salient point that you make in terms of where we're pushing them out and then where we're pushing them to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'll build a prison, so you're going to need somebody to be in those prisons. So who better to have in those prisons from White Logics? It is going to be black and indigenous bodies, right? And so, and if they're going to be there, then you're going to need more of them to be there, and they're going to have to be there for longer and longer periods, right? And so you're going to have to find more things to be criminal. You talk about school resource officers, police in schools. Here we have police officers walking in our schools, mediating against things that were formerly dealt with by teachers and school administrators. But you need a constant.
And Rohan, when you talked about, some powerfully unexamined ideas and how I connect that to anti-Black racism, if we're at a point where people want to, or systems want to acknowledge and address anti-Black racism, what are the views held of people racially categorized as Black that fuels their interpretation and then their responses to anti-Black racism? And so some things that come to mind again, and often I see or hear, is really this not only around the supposed deviancy of Blackness, but there's also a deficit lens applied to Black people and to Black experiences, and that is often used as the total sum of Black people. And so, the idea then becomes, well, Black people are lacking, intelligence, lacking income, lacking this and lacking that. And therefore, it is then incumbent upon the white majority and white benevolence in order to help and to fix what is wrong with Black people and Black families and Black communities. Or that they are lacking food, or they're lacking shoes. Like these ideas are prevalent and then have been fueling the interpretation and the responses to anti-Black racism, and not about how the system is acting upon itself. But that has to be turned upon its head. And absolutely, Black people are a segment of lower socioeconomic groups, but they are not the only people in lower socioeconomic groups. And when we look at, again, the results in Peel and the demographics of Peel as more racially disaggregated data comes out, we have Black children who are coming from, for example, two-parent household, parents who are university graduates and people who are homeowners, students who are brilliant, students who are gifted, not students who are often labeled as struggling. And so that has to be troubled, this deficit idea that perpetuates systemic anti-Black racism in public education.
When we think about even where access is and who provides it and what systems, we talk about, for example, academic streaming, and we talk about the clear lines of who goes into academic or university prep courses and who goes into college-bound courses or applied courses. What we rarely talk about are the programs. So even within academic programs, who does computer engineering, right? You talk about color blindness. Who is walking around and saying, if we have a class, or if we have right across our system, robotics programs and computer engineering programs and all sorts of science and technology programs, if we have in our board 10% of our children who are Black, are those students represented in these programs? So it's not just right. It's not just the stream that they're in. It's the programs that they're also doing. And then you talk about powerfully unexamined ideas. What does the idea that Black people are cognitively inferior have to do with which courses we think that Black children are going to be in? And then you talk about state-sanctioned work and you say to yourself, what does this have to do as a state? How are you going to ensure, right? The processes to get into these programs are not discriminatory, right? Right now in Peel we have regional choice programs, and we know that Black students are underrepresented, and the numbers are like in most categories are below 2% of Black children in those programs. But you have a lottery system to get in. So when you're 7% or 10% of the population, and to get into a program, you have to use a lottery system to get into that program. What are the chances? I'm not going to play into stereotypes and say that I don't know the math. But you know what I mean? It's what are the chances of getting in? And then when you get in, as probably the only Black child in that class, what does it mean for your sense of belonging? Right? What does it mean for your sense of belonging when their ideologies or original We Rise Together report talked about Black students being in particular classes and having their peers and their teachers express disbelief that they're in these classes, right? And it's funny because this type of streaming and this type of anti-Blackness is not only geared at students. Black staff. Well, Melissa will get on with staff, but the same types of low expectations, the same types of disbelief that you could do a particular thing, the same type of saying, this is above you, happens with Black staff as well.
And so what are the consequences for those who decide to opt out, right? What are the consequences for those who perform it in the most gross ways? What are the consequences for those who do not listen to those who have that expertise, right? If I had an architectural engineer come in and say, you need to do this for the building, right? If I signed off on something that said, no, I'm not listening to you, there would be consequence for me. Right? And so, this whole conversation of accountability for whom and what and how, I think also needs to delve as part of this conversation. But Fiona, there's a couple of things that you touched on that, really, that you touched on that I think is important that I hope everybody really caught is, how you clearly laid out the difference between interpersonal and systemic. Right? I think it's really important for folks to understand that. Natasha, you very eloquently spoke about how Blackness is framed as a deficit, right? And so inversely, you have whiteness framed as an asset, right? And I think these are some really important points, and all of you, spoke to, what are the ideas or the characteristics that we put on particular bodies, on black bodies? What are the ideas and characteristics that we put on white bodies that give allowance, clearance, license to turn around and surveil, right, and treat appropriately based off of those particular ideas. This has been a great conversation. I know, if nothing else, this is kind of like a master class, so thank you guys. I appreciate it. We covered lots of ground: whiteness, anti-black racism, school-to-prison pipeline, white supremacy, and a slew of other ideas that bring the connection to help to understand the experience, the aggregate experience of black folks within the system, whether that be community, whether that be students, whether that be caregivers, whether that be staff, right? And I think the one piece that I think that is really important in this learning journey, because I hear that often, but it's learning to what extent, right? It's important to learn, it's important to become more knowledgeable, but learning for what? For what purpose? And so for all of the folks who identify as though that they're on this learning journey, for folks who identify as white, for non-black folks who all of this stuff is sort of new to them in terms of being educators and decision makers in our system, it is incumbent upon you to do this learning to actually disrupt and dismantle and create change that addresses disproportionate outcomes, right? And if it's not that, I'm not sure what it is that we're doing, right? So I think you guys laid fantastic groundwork, so thank you. Great conversation, and please invite me back anytime.